Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Katie Smoller. I'm the Director of Educational Programs here with the National History Academy. And today we are joined by Park Ranger Lisa Mead from the National First Ladies Historic Site. So Lisa, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. I will share my screen here, and then I'm excited to show you all our site. All right, yeah. So like she said, my name is Ranger Lisa, and I work at First Ladies National Historic Site. First Ladies is one of the over 400 sites that make up the National Park Service, and we are located in Canton, Ohio. And if you don't know where that is, it's about an hour south of Cleveland, most famous for the Football Hall of Fame, but we're there too. So our site is, of course, dedicated to preserving and interpreting the legacy of First Ladies of the United States. So we have two buildings. The first one I'm going to talk about here is our Education Center. It's a tall building because we're right in the middle of downtown Canton, so if you kind of blend in. But inside this building, you will find rotating exhibits about First Ladies of the United States. So there are dresses, artifacts, letters, everything that has to do with First Ladies. And then this is also the place where a lot of people are excited about to come and get their Junior Ranger badge, like these two kids in this picture. You can tell they have a lot. And then in our lower level, we have a film that shows about First Ladies, and that building is completely free to visit. And then our other building that I'm going to focus on is the historic Saxton House. So this house was home to President McKinley and his wife, Ida Saxton McKinley, but it was her family home. So our story is really going to focus in on her. And if we walk right up the stairs and enter through that front door, you'll see the front foyer here. So this big staircase actually goes all the way up to the third floor. If we look at a different angle, you'll see that there's kind of two sets there. And so we're standing right in the middle. The house is really large. It's about 8,000 square feet. And we're on the first floor here, right through the front door. So if you're not familiar with our main character today, let me introduce her to you. So this is Ida McKinley. She was born in this house, in the Saxton House in 1847. She came from a pretty wealthy family. She was well educated and really independent at a young age. And then at the age of 49, she became First Lady of the United States. So I'm going to call her First Lady throughout this program, although that is not a term that would have been familiar to her. That's one of our more modern terms. But she was married to the president, so I'm going to call her First Lady. So when she becomes First Lady of the United States, her level of involvement is really controlled by societal expectations, her health, and her own drive to be involved. And just like all First Ladies, she had the ear of the head of government. So with that comes opportunity. So we're going to learn about her life, especially her young life, because it's going to drastically change as she gets a little older. So we'll start at the beginning. So back to that foyer. And if we were going to walk to the left and open those big double doors, you would find yourself in this room. So this is the family parlor. It's one of like two living room style spaces we have in this house. So this is a space for the family to gather, spend time together, talk, play games. And during this time, there would have certainly been a lot to talk about. So in the formative young years Ida spent growing up in this house, this country was a rapidly changing place. So we had the additions of California and Oregon and other Western territories. The country was expanding, but this expansion brought on other questions about our national identity. So organizations on women's suffrage were gaining momentum, and books like Frederick Douglass's autobiography and Uncle Tom's Cabin were having a huge impact on the abolitionist movement. And in 1861, when Ida's just a teenager, the country erupted in a civil war. So you can imagine some of the conversations that would have been held in this room could have been pretty tense. And also in this room, there's a big picture above the fireplace. So that is Ida's father. We're actually going to grab that and carry it with us to the next slide here to bring it next to Ida's mother so we can talk about them both. So this is the other side of that same room. So her parents, James and Catherine, inherited this house from Ida's grandparents. So the house was originally built by her grandparents, then it went down to her mother, and then it went down to her sister. So Ida is actually one of three kids. So this picture was on the other side of the wall in that family parlor. So Ida is the oldest. She's actually standing right there in the middle. And then she has her sister to the other side, her sister Mary, who's the middle girl. And then their youngest brother, George, is on the other side. And Mary, the middle daughter, is the one who inherits the house and is the main caretaker for the house. So if we keep walking through this space, we'll find ourselves in the library. So when all her siblings are all grown up, Ida, her sister Mary, and her brother George, they're actually all living in this house together at a certain point. So really, at one point in time, there are 13 people living in this house because Mary has 7 children and she's married. Their brother George is in and out as he pleases, and Ida and William McKinley will eventually make their way to the 3rd floor. So it's a large house at over 8,000 square feet, but it is filled with people. So as we're walking through the house, it's actually styled and historically redone to look like all the adult siblings are living in here now. So if we keep walking and we turn the other way, we see some bookcases. There are many books, but remember during this time and they're living in this house, there's no electricity in private homes. So no TV, really no radio, no cell phone. So if they're gonna entertain themselves, they're probably just gonna read a book. And then on the other side of that room, if we take a look at that rug, that's a pretty significant artifact to Ida. That was actually picked up by her on a trip to the Southwest. So Ida loved to travel. Traveling by train was really new and exciting. And so on one of the trips, they went out to the Southwest, what would become Arizona, and they purchased this rug. She also went hiking. Ida was an avid hiker in her youth. She liked to walk every day, rain or shine. Well, that sounds relatively normal for today's days. That was not normal at all during her time for a woman. Women were not expected to exercise or move around too much. But Ida loves to walk, so that's what she does. We'll get another view before we move on. And then if we keep walking through this space, we'll find ourselves in the formal dining room. And then there are 2 other doors at the back of this room that lead to a kitchen and then to a breakfast room. So that kitchen was super basic because that's not where the main meal production was done. So the Saxtons had a whole staff of people working in the house, and they were paid staff. They didn't live in the house with the family. They lived in apartments in town, but they would just commute to work like you or I would and work in the lower level of the house, making all the food, doing all the cooking and cleaning. And then there's a back staircase. They would come up to that back kitchen back there. You can see the doorway open too. And they would set the food on there, put on like the finishing touches before serving it to the family here in the formal dining room that we can see. And this formal dining room was just for adults to eat. All the kids, especially all of Mary's 7 children, would eat in a breakfast room, which is through the other doorway there. So we can get a closer look at that kitchen. And then through that doorway, you see there is the breakfast room where the kids would eat. But now we're gonna make our way backtrack through the kitchen, the dining room, the library, through the formal parlor and find yourself in this foyer again. So if we go through the other doorway this time, we're going to go to the right. We would find ourselves in the formal parlor. So this is another one of those living room spaces, except this space is the welcome guest. So in this space, there's an artifact that's pretty significant to Ida. Right under the fireplace there is a music box. So Ida, once she went to school, she came back to Canton. She actually starts working at her father's bank, which again was pretty unusual for a woman of this time. And then she takes a 6-month leave of absence from the bank and she goes to Europe with her sister. So it's her sister Mary, and then a chaperone that travels with them. So at one of the stops in Switzerland, Geneva, Switzerland, in 1869, she purchases this music box. And it's a gift for her mother. She sends it back to her. And then as they're traveling throughout the countryside, they make their way from Switzerland to Brussels. And there in Brussels, Ida sees something she's never before seen in her entire life. She sees poverty for the first time. She sees women working in fields alongside men, people selling lace to survive, men, women, and children sleeping in barns with animals, and she just can't believe it. She's never seen anything like that in her entire life. But if you think about Ida's life growing up here in Canton, the daughter of one of the wealthiest families in town, surely it existed here. She just didn't come across it in her daily life. But it was something that's going to stick with her forever, an experience she'll never forget. Now, if we go back out of this room, we're actually going to head upstairs And we're not going to stop at the second floor. We're going to go all the way up to the very top, to the third floor, and we'll find ourselves in the ballroom. So when Ida comes home from Europe, this new third floor ballroom is completed, and there are many dances that are happening here. The guest of a lot of those dances is the new young lawyer in town, and that's William McKinley. So he is not from Canton, Ohio. He was actually born in another Ohio city, Niles, Ohio. But he comes to Canton as a young man to start his law firm, because that's what he is initially, a lawyer. And he becomes a friend of James Saxton, Ida's dad. And so they're hanging out here. He's a guest of their parties. And here he really gets to know Ida. And they end up getting married on January 25th, 1871 at the local Presbyterian church. And then they return to this ballroom to have a small reception with friends and family. I have a picture of young McKinley here during this time. So after they get married, they actually move into a different house. So this house is just a picture because it no longer exists. But they move into here and they're here about 4 years. And during that time, they have 2 children, 2 girls that are about a year and a half apart. And then this is where the real tragedy in Ida's life starts. So her grandmother died not long after she was married. And then a few years later, her mother died, and then her baby died at 4 months old. So after that, Ida no longer wants to live in this house, this original house they were living in, which was owned by her father and just like a half a mile up the street from the Saxton House. So they decide to leave this house and they move into the Saxton House. So they actually move into this room. They transform it from the ballroom like you see it now into an apartment. So the 3 of them, Ida, Katie, and William McKinley, will find themselves on, let me go back one, find themselves living in this space. They set up a sitting area right where you see this table. And then behind where you will be standing in this view, they have a bedroom. And then William McKinley sets up his office in here. So this is on the 3rd floor as well. And despite the tragedy in his life, William McKinley rose quickly in his career. He was elected to Congress and then governor of Ohio in 1891 and then again in 1893. And in 1896, he is selected as the Republican nominee for president of the United States. So during this time, it was really common for presidents to do a front porch campaign. So you have a picture of one of those that McKinley did. In fact, William McKinley and Ida are right there in the middle. So you're right over here. And this one is actually a group of women. So during this time, women could not vote, but they were important to campaign to because they convinced their husbands and brothers and all the men they knew of who to vote for. So even women came to these campaign events. And this was not done at the Saxton House. So if you look at this porch here, it might look familiar as that picture of the other house I showed you. They used their original house as somewhat of a campaign office. So even though they weren't living there, that's where they had the front porch campaign. And during this time, as you can see from this picture, Ida is often right next to William McKinley as he's campaigning. And then people begin to notice things about Ida. So Ida, after her second pregnancy, began to have some health issues. And then, unfortunately, it wasn't long after she lost her first child that she lost her second child as well. So both her 2 daughters died at a young age. The oldest was 4 and the youngest was 4 months. And her health issues just deteriorate more after that. So when people are coming to William McKinley's front porch campaign, they notice that she's not exactly well all the time. And then there's a growing concern about William McKinley's ability to focus on the hard job of being president of the United States. If his wife is so sick, won't he be distracted in caring for her and not being able to focus on all of his presidential duties? So to combat that, the campaign begins handing out biographies on Ida, where they try to convince people that she's okay, she's not as sick as she looks. They also create the first ever campaign button with a First Lady's face on it to hand out at this time, all to convince people that Ida's really not as sick as she looks, trust McKinley and vote for him. Apparently it does work because, as we know, he becomes president of the United States. He moves into the White House with his wife in 1897 in March, and that leaves the Saxton House as the place they're returning to when they can. So whenever they get a break and they want to come home, here is where they're coming back to Canton and living in the third floor of the Saxton House. So as a president, McKinley was known as kind of a quiet intellectual with a good reputation on the economy. And through the acquisitions of multiple territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, it's during his presidency that the United States becomes a major world power. And of course, William McKinley's election as president makes Ida First Lady. So we're going to travel back downstairs to talk about some of the things she did as First Lady. So we'll go back down that staircase, stopping at the second floor. We'll find ourselves right where that star is. And you can see on this kind of second floor diagram that this space has a ton of rooms. So these rooms would have been the space where Mary and her 7 children are living, but we've transformed them so that we can keep telling Ida's story. So the first room we're going to stop in has some pictures of Ida, some commemorative things that were made when she was in the White House, and it has a pair of slippers. So on the shelf kind of to the right in the middle, there is a pair of crocheted slippers. If we take a closer look, you can see them here. So these slippers are one of the thousands of pairs of slippers that were crocheted by Ida. In fact, based on her estimate, she crocheted about 3,000 of them. So she had a plan with all of those slippers. She would make them and then donate them to charities. And then the charity had something made by the president's wife, so they could gain a lot of attention, and then they could auction it off to raise money for their cause. So in that way, Ida's not too different from some of our modern first ladies that are all now expected to use their platform to advocate for a cause. And this may seem like kind of a small gesture, but in the 1890s, many were not accepting of women in politics. So this is her way of getting involved in advocating for the causes she cares about. And it really opened the door for women who came after her to use their own platform. And we can also see on the left here, Ida seated. So that gives us a good way to talk about her disability in the White House. So when she's in the White House, her illness has gotten progressively worse. And so although their ailment is not openly discussed in the press, the care that William McKinley provided her really helps portray him as a devoted husband. And it's during her time in the White House that they're really calling in doctor after doctor after doctor to figure out what's happening with Ida. And so one of those doctors does diagnose her with epilepsy. So she is having seizures, but she's also having some muscle control issues. So whether that diagnosis is right, it really doesn't seem like it. But during her time, it was suspected that there was something wrong with the health of a woman. It was likely because she was too active. So Ida is prescribed heavy sedatives during her time in the White House, especially during White House receptions, because they don't want to risk her having a seizure and that drawing negative attention to the McKinley administration. So knowing that, it makes it extra impressive that she managed to crochet all those slippers and still be involved to the level she wanted. And once we move through our last rooms, they're actually made to look like this house. So we're back to the campaign house because, as a surprise to Ida, William McKinley repurchased this house when he was president, intending for them to move into it after his second term. But if you know the end of the McKinley story, you know that it does not work out that way. So it's at the beginning of his second term in 1901, in September of 1901, when McKinley is shot by an anarchist in Buffalo, New York. And initially, they believe his injury is not that serious. They even tell Vice President Teddy Roosevelt to stay on vacation with his family because McKinley's going to recover from this. But it's not the shot that kills him, it's the surgery that leads to an infection, and McKinley ends up dying 8 days later. So at that point, Ida does return to Canton. So here we can see the sitting room that she would have been in at the end of her life. There's a picture of their daughter Katie above the fireplace there, and that picture has traveled with her throughout her life. And here's its final spot at her last home. And if we keep walking, we'll go through this doorway and into her bedroom. So this would have been her bedroom at the end of her life. And she lives at the campaign house, which is just down the street from the Saxton House. She continues her crocheting, but There are not really a lot of organizations that want a donation for her now. And then in 1907, 6 years after McKinley's death, she passes away. She was a few weeks away from her 60th birthday, so she was 59 years old, and we don't really know what she died of. It could have been the illness she had the whole time. She also wrote a letter to her nieces that she had been sick with the flu a few weeks before, so it could have been that, but we're not really sure. So Ida McKinley is sometimes thought of as an inactive or absent First Lady. That seems to be far from true from what we know about her. She was a confident and advisor to the president, and just like all First Ladies, she had a choice of how involved to be. And despite her failing health, she chose to crochet over 3,000 slippers. So First Ladies may have a bigger platform, but the choice for them is the same for us. What do we do with the opportunities life gives us? And thank you. That is all I have for you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And we do have some questions for you, if that's all right.
No
We're going to be joined
problem.
now by Ben Kellerhals. He's our intern here at National History Academy. So Ben, thank you for helping us out today.
Yeah, great presentation. And I never knew much about Ida McKinley, so that is interesting. Yeah, so let's start here. You mentioned that this is a relatively new site. What was the process like to get this site started?
Sure. Yeah, well, it all started in the mid 1990s, so not long ago at all. And the Saxton House had fallen into disrepair. Like by 1920, the family had sold the house. It had become many things because of its location in downtown Canton. And so eventually the city of Canton just wanted it gone. And so there was a descendant of Ida's sister Mary who purchased the house and then worked with the National Park Service and a local nonprofit to restore it. So it really almost wasn't here. And it all started with the house. Once this nonprofit was working on the house, they found that other people had stuff from First Ladies with like no real place to go. And so they started receiving all these donations of things. And then they got the other building and they thought, well, this can be more than just about Ida and William McKinley. It can be about First Ladies in general. So that's how the idea came about. And it's not that old at all.
Yeah, so going off of that, what is I mean, we got somewhat of a taste of it, but what is the balance like as far as talking about Ida McKinley, I mean, and the reason it's in Canton versus trying to incorporate some almost 50 other people?
Yeah, so I would say it's a difficult, it's a difficult balance. Obviously, we are an Ida heavy site. We can't fight that we have this huge resource that one of our buildings is completely dedicated to that. But we try to use her to tell multiple stories. And even if we're not working in every single name, the themes are kind of the same. I think all of these women have one thing in common is that someone came into their life and changed it dramatically. And I think that's something that a lot of people can relate to, even if we're not talking about individual First Ladies. And then in our other building, there's almost no Ida because we're just talking about the other First Ladies. So it depends. If you just go on a house tour, then you're going to get a pretty heavy Ida experience. If you come into the education center, you're going to get an experience with a lot of different First Ladies.
That makes sense, yeah. Let's see, we have a question. Do you know if Ida had any formal school, and if so, how much?
She was extremely well educated. So she went to 3 different women's boarding schools that are no longer in existence. And her father was kind of unique for the time period. He was pretty progressive on like women's rights, especially in education. So he would write to her teachers to make sure that they're teaching her the things that she needs to know about like math and finance and business, not just what was called at that time the female arts. So she did do like music, which was traditional for women, but she also had like a pretty rigorous education and she spoke 3 different languages. So we would say her equivalent in today's terms is like a master's of fine arts.
Wow, yeah, that's quite crazy for the time. I wonder, okay, so that influences another thought we wanted to get into here, which is part of the tradition of some First Ladies that stands out a lot, like Woodrow Wilson, and his wife, and so on, Dolly Madison and so on, is these moments where they sort of take charge, and you hear the sort of argument that maybe Woodrow Wilson's wife was the first female president because of this year spent, these sort of things. In what ways do you see that as a pattern? Are there examples really where Ida could be seen doing a lot as far as the presidency role goes?
So we know from some of her diary entries that she would kind of listen and advise him on some things. But for her, I think it was clear McKinley was really the president. But she definitely wasn't a Edith Wilson or someone who tried to take control there. And I think, let's see, as we've gotten into more modern times, I think that would be so shocking to us that the real, what's probably happening is that it's more behind the scenes control. Like, I think my boss always says he thinks the most powerful first lady was Nancy Reagan, that she was behind the scenes making sure that Ronald Reagan was doing exactly what she thought he should do. So I think if that stuff is happening, we don't know about it.
Yeah, and yeah, it certainly is a more modern development. I think for oftentimes it's sort of discussed like that Hillary Clinton with her taking on healthcare in the early 90s was sort of the first time that a first lady like had an agenda, but you can see how it really developed over a lot of time. Let's see. Are the books on this site like in the house original? And if not, do we know what types of books they would read?
So they're not the original ones to the house, they're original to the time period. The bookshelves are original to the house. But yeah, because we did have photographs of the house during that time, they are like the same edition, the same titles that we knew were in there, but they're not the original ones that like Ida McKinley would have held. And so yeah, there is a variety. There's some like fantasy, some travel. Like being able to travel was kind of new. So that idea, whenever they went somewhere, they would pick up books about the area and bring them back, especially to all their nieces and nephews that were in the house.
Very cool, very cool. I think this is a site that this question might be especially relevant for, but we always want to right now get into why or how has your site changed or dealt with the very political nature of history as it is right now. And just in recent years, everything is very amped up, especially with presidents, but maybe especially with telling women's history as well. So how does your site work with that, or how has it reacted with that climate?
Oh, it's been difficult. We're an inherently political site, especially, I mean, every 4 to 8 years, we have a new person that we have to add to our story. So yeah, I mean, how we've dealt with it is we've made a decision not to interpret the current first lady. That's a line we can draw when we're not political. And really for us, once we started thinking about it, it didn't make sense to start talking about them when they haven't completed what they're doing. So even for our ease, it just made sense not to do it. And then other than that, just interpreting women's history in general, we haven't had a lot of like difficult interactions or pushbacks on it. I think people have been really open to hearing new things or new stories. And what's interesting about our site, I think it would be more difficult if I worked at a site that had a more famous person that it was dedicated to. Like if I worked at Mount Vernon and I was talking to people about George Washington, I think my interpretation I would get more pushback for that. But since, like you said earlier, people don't know Ida McKinley, so they don't have this preconceived notion of who she is. So when I'm telling these stories, it's all new to them. And so they're not having strong reactions to it. And even William McKinley is not a super famous president. So talking about his history and dealing with like her illness can get a little tricky sometimes, because during that time, the women didn't talk to the doctors. Her husband talked to the doctor and they decided what to do. So there can be like a kind of reaction to that. I'm just like, my opinion is just tell the truth. If something's bad, we have to talk about it.
Yeah, right. Open and honest. Let's see. Are there any McKinley relatives still living in the Canton area?
So there are no direct descendants from Ida and William McKinley. There are a ton from her sister. And then William McKinley, I think, was one of 8. So there are other McKinleys. And actually, his sister was the first of the McKinleys to come to Canton. And so even we have McKinley High School here, and it's actually named after her because she was an educator and she did this huge like transformative thing with the public schools here. And then slowly it just merged into being named after him. So there are descendants from the other McKinleys, but not from Ida and William McKinley specifically.
Interesting. Yeah. But I think we're almost out of questions, but let's see. Yeah. So what was sort of the climate for Ida McKinley and maybe other first ladies before and after her around that time period where what was their influence or opinion on women's suffrage, as that was like would become the big issue of the day very shortly after McKinley's presidency. And we know his successor, Teddy Roosevelt, was somewhat progressive on those issues. Yeah.
So Ida, it seems like she may have been for it, although she never comes out and says explicitly like women should have the right to vote. Later, you see Helen Taft feels that way strongly. She doesn't say it while she's in office, but later it comes out, that type of thing. There's a real like political dance they do where they don't say they're really for or against anything. But I think the most interesting one was Edith Wilson. So of course, the women's suffrage passed during the Wilson administration, and Edith Wilson could not hate the suffragists more. She really couldn't stand them. They were picketing outside the White House, and she thought it was embarrassing and unladylike. And she thought really that they were making a mockery of the Wilson administration. And there's nothing she cared about more than protecting Woodrow Wilson. And then later, of course, after it all happened, she starts voting. So it seemed like it had less to do with the issue and more to do with them.
Right. Yeah. The Wilsons get a classic sort of wannabe Southerners and traditionalists. Wow. I think that might be, unless I'm missing any from Facebook still, that might be all the questions we have. We always like to end though with asking you, as our great guide today, how did you get to where you are? We have a lot of future historians, future park workers, and so on. So any advice you might give?
I say my path is super untraditional. So I started my career as a social worker. I had gone to school for sociology and I was kind of working in social services, but obviously I was doing sociology when I was in school, so I had an interest in history. And after a while, I kind of got burnout on what I was doing. And so I had a friend that worked for the National Park Service, and she suggested that I look into this since there was a lot of kind of overlap that I never really considered. I'm working with people, I'm talking about history. And once I started, it just made the most sense for me. And that was 7 years ago. And then my only advice would be, I mean, if a door opens, you might want to take it.
That's great. Lisa, thank you so much for sharing. And Ben, as always, thank you for helping us out with the Q&A. And we just really appreciate you taking the time for being with us today.
Sure, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Yes, and looking forward to visit in person one day. And yeah, we're excited to see where the site goes from here.
Yeah, I think it's exciting. We should be a completely different place in like 5 years.
And thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll be back here next week as we continue our virtual tour through U.S. history sites as we visit Appomattox Courthouse National Historic Park. So I hope to see you then and have a wonderful rest of your day.